Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicions class. We're in week 1 looking at Kafka's In the Penal Colony and the Great Wall of China. Before we get into Kafka though, we're going to go back and give a little context for what we're doing. In the last session we read through Heidegger in order to gain a philosophical foundation for ways that we can critically scrutinize the world. Heidegger exposed our relationship to a world of objective things that knit together a world into which we're thrown. Signs, buildings, clothing, vehicles, stores. All these things provide us with a set of assumptions about how things work. In Being and Time, Heidegger focuses on how the fact that these things are a world to us only manifests in the failure of our equipment. The world demands our attention when we really need a hammer or a cup of coffee and we can't find one. We then discuss the social world that we're thrown into, one that's inauthentic in its relationships. We occupy our time with busyness, with idle talk, with the kind of curiosity that renders us unthoughtful. We notice this world when we're overcome by the attunement of angst, the situation where precisely nothing is wrong, but that nothing is something that individuates us against the world. We concluded our work in Being and Time by briefly discussing being toward death as a resolute way of being that reminds us of our individual potential, as opposed to being part of the they, knowing what they know and doing what they do. The last 2 weeks of the course we focused on Heidegger's essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, which discussed how art preserves a new world in concrete forms, including language, that looks for preservers willing to be displaced from the common world of the they. The choice of Kafka as the next Masters of Suspicion course is intended to build on Heidegger's notion that art displaces us from our normal assumptions and provides us with truths that we're invited to preserve. These truths distance us from the ordinary assumptions of the world. In offering us a different perspective of the world we live in, Kafka's art performs a sort of suspicious inquiry that he invites us to inhabit or embrace. A bit of biography before we continue. Kafka was born in 1883 into a middle-class German-Jewish family living in Prague. He was educated in law and ended up working for insurance companies as a way to fund his literary career. He was engaged twice to a woman named Felice Bauer between 1912 and 1917 when he contracted tuberculosis. Most believe that Kafka has suffered from clinical depression and social anxiety throughout his entire life. He also suffered from migraines, insomnia, constipation, boils, and other ailments, all usually brought on by excessive stresses and strains. These kinds of stresses and strains are very apparent when one reads Kafka. You can see why that might be the case. Kafka attempted to counteract all this by a regime of naturopathic treatments, such as a vegetarian diet, but he finally died of tuberculosis in 1924. His major novels were incomplete, but he wrote a number of short stories and parables that are included within his canonical texts. We'll be reading 2 of the novels and 3 of the short stories during this course. So, in today's class, we'll look through 2 of Kafka's well-known shorter works, The Great Wall of China and In the Penal Colony, in order to get a sense of how Kafka pushes readers to understand the world. During The Great Wall, we'll look at the sense of scale that Kafka introduces and follow how this sense of scale works for and against a sense of political power. So, in The Great Wall, the narrator starts out with a puzzle concerning the building of the Great Wall of China. Why was it done in disconnected sections? Why wasn't it built more efficiently, especially when the stakes of its being built were so desperate, a matter of life and death? The narrator gives reasons, and I'll just go ahead and list the argument in the order that it's provided in the text. 1. He says that there was a lack of skilled workers who were able to organize the less educated laborers. This gap in knowledge existed in spite of a 50-year push towards STEM education. In that time, it was mostly masonry. Number 2. There was a need to care for the more skilled workers. And here I'll read a bit from the text itself. Kafka writes, "The hopelessness of such a hard task, which could not be completed even in a long human lifetime, would have caused them distress and more than anything else made them worthless for work. For that reason, the system of building in sections was chosen. 500 meters could be completed in something like 5 years, by which time naturally the supervisors were, as a rule, too exhausted and had lost all faith in themselves, in the building, and in the world. Thus, while they were still experiencing the elation of the celebrations for the joining up of 1,000 meters of the wall, they were shipped far, far away. On their journey, they saw here and there finished sections of the wall rising up. They passed through the quarters of the higher administrators who gave them gifts as badges of honor, and they heard the rejoicing of new armies of workers streaming past them out of the depths of the land, saw forests being laid low, witnessed mountains being broken up into rocks for the wall, and heard in the holy places the hymns of the pious praying for the construction to be finished. All this calmed their impatience. The quiet life of home, where they spent some time, reinvigorated them. The high regard which all those doing the building enjoyed, the devout humility with which people listened to their reports, the trust which simple, quiet citizens had that the wall would be completed someday, all this tuned at the strings of their souls. Then, like eternally hopeful children, they took leave of their home. The enthusiasm for laboring once again at the people's work became irresistible. On all the roads there were groups of people, pennants, banners. They'd never seen how great and rich and beautiful and endearing their country was. Every countryman was a brother for whom they were building a protective wall and who would thank him with everything he had was for all his life. Unity, unity, shoulder to shoulder, a coordinated movement of the people, their blood no longer confined in the limited circulation of the body, but rolling sweetly and yet still returning through the infinite extent of China. And it's a long passage, but essentially he looks at how power realizes there's a need for us to be connected to nation, to people, to community. And the way to do that isn't to be off doing a distant work for the sake of somebody, but to really invest and engage in what the homeland is and who the people are, and to remember the purpose and the motive for why one does it, not because it's instructed from on high, but because one witnesses it from the very depth of one's being. Anyway, the third point Kafka makes is that this would build the foundations of a better Tower of Babel. It's kind of a weird and obscure paragraph, but it's this mystical kind of notion that he alludes to in passing. The fourth reason why the wall is constructed the way that it is due to the leadership. Here's what Kafka writes. In the office of the leadership, where it was and who sat there, no one I asked knows or knew. In this office, I imagine that all human thoughts and wishes revolve in a circle, and all human aims and fulfillments in a circle going in the opposite direction. And at this point in the text, again, thoughts and wishes are going one way, and they're going opposed to where the direction that all human aims and fulfillments are. And there's a conflict between what we wish and how we're fulfilled. It's interesting. But through the window, the reflection of the divine worlds fell onto the hands of the leadership as they drove the plans. And for this reason, the incorruptible observer, and again, Kafka's adjectives are great, just that little introduction of incorruptible before observer, will reject the notion that if the leadership had seriously wanted a continuous construction of the wall, they would not have been able to overcome the difficulty standing in its way. So, the only conclusion left is that the leadership deliberately chose piecemeal construction. But building in sections was something merely makeshift and impractical. So the conclusion remains that the leadership wanted something impractical. That's an odd conclusion to come to because it seems fairly counterintuitive, unless you go back up to earlier in the text where Kafka describes how thoughts and wishes go one way, aims and fulfillments go the other way, and there's always going to be a conflict between those things. Kafka keeps writing about the leadership, though, and in the fifth point that he makes, it's the question of obedience that becomes important. He says, quote, "At that time, for many people, even the best, there was a secret principle. Try with all your powers to understand the orders of the leadership, but only up to a certain point. Then stop thinking about them. A very reasonable principle, which incidentally found an even wider interpretation and in later, often repeated comparison, stop further thinking. Not because it could harm you. It is not at all certain that it will harm you. In this matter, one cannot speak in general about harming or not harming. Okay? But there's still the imperative to stop further thinking. And here's the analogy that he uses to explain why. What will happen to you is like a river in spring. It rises, grows stronger, eats away more powerfully at the land along its banks, and it still maintains its own course down to sea and is more welcome as a fitter partner for the sea. Reflect upon the orders of leadership as far as that. But then the river overflows its banks, loses its form and shape, slows down its forward movement, tries, contrary to its destiny, to form small seas inland, damages the fields, and yet cannot maintain its expansion long, but runs back within its banks. In fact, even dries up miserably in the hot time of the year which follows. Do not reflect on the orders of leadership to that extent." And again, the overarching importance for Kafka, at least relative to this narrator's perspective, is what will fulfill destiny? What's the common goal or the common good? What ought one to do? Where ought one direct one's energies? And it's wasted if one thinks so much that one can't move forward at all. Number 6, the sixth kind of step in his argument. It's the problem that those in the southeast of China weren't troubled by northern invaders. And again, the context of the Great Wall, the northern invaders are going to swoop down and kill everybody, and it will all be bad for everybody. But the people in the southeast aren't worried about this. So here's what Kafka writes. And if I may be permitted such ideas about the leadership, then I must say that in my view, the leadership existed even earlier. It did not come together like some high mandarins quickly summoned to a meeting by a beautiful dream of the future, something hastily concluded. On the contrary, I imagine the leadership has existed since time immemorial, along with the decision to construct the wall as well. Innocent northern people believed that they were the cause. The admirable and innocent emperor believed that he had given orders for it. We who are the builders of the wall know otherwise and are silent. So what Kafka implies here is that power always exists. Independent of those who obey and those who give commands, the structure of power is always there, and it commands because obedience justifies the existence of power. The emperor obeys the need to command, the people obey the commands, but the power overarching is what does the commanding. The objectives, in any case, are less important than instituting a hierarchy that demands obedience. And that seems to be at least something along the lines of what Kafka's getting at. Number 7. Here Kafka's narrator engages in questioning institutions and education. He says, quote, now among our most obscure institutions, one can certainly include the empire itself. Of course, in Peking, right in the court, there's some clarity about it, although even this is more apparent than real. And again, that's a fairly typical Kafka-esque statement to look at something that seems clear and then say, well, that clarity is only apparent, it's not real. What's real is absolute confusion. You never have certainty. You can never know anything about the world around you. To continue, the deeper one descends into the lower schools, a superficial education surges up as high as a mountain around a few precepts drilled into them for centuries, sayings which, in fact, have lost nothing of their eternal truth, but which also remain eternally unrecognized in this mist and fog. And this is not necessarily something foreign to America today, where we have a whole bunch of precepts and a whole bunch of long-standing truths, whether it be the Golden Rule or the Constitution, or things that aren't less true because we still practice it, but the way that they are true, or what it means that they're true, is totally shrouded in fog. So people just end up quoting sayings without really being able to understand or invest in why those things are important. Number 8, problems with knowing the emperor. There are 3 of them that the narrator lists. 1, you can only receive rumors about the emperor. It was hardly possible to learn anything, says the narrator. Number 2, the emperor is only human. Although he's great, he still yawns. There's nothing divine about those who hold power. They're still human beings. They still make decisions. Those decisions are no better and no worse than any of ours. They're some of both, usually for the worse. 3, or C under 8, the land is vast and the news is always already obsolete. So anything you learn about the emperor is already not true by the time you learn it. It doesn't matter what you've learned. It doesn't matter what you know. It's not any good anymore. He continues this in kind of the 9th point that he makes in the story, the legend of the messenger. He says, quote, there's a message for you, but the messenger cannot fight the throngs to deliver it. You can wait and there may be a message, but you'll never get it. Thus, that's exactly how our people look at the emperor, hopelessly and full of hope. You're really important, but you'll never know it. But you can always hope and always know that it's coming, and also know hopelessly that you'll never receive it. He says, quote, they don't even know which emperor is on the throne, and there are even doubts about the name of the dynasty. And that's politics. 10, in conclusion, quote, we have no emperor at all. Here's the narrator again. If one wanted to conclude from such phenomena that we basically have no emperor at all, one would not be far from the truth. And again, that's really classic Kafka. You never know the truth. You're just never far, or not too far from the truth. But you don't know the truth. You don't get it. You never have a point where you actually have the whole truth given to you. You're just not far from it. And that's as close as Kafka is willing to concede one can get. To continue. I need to say it again and again. There is perhaps no people more faithful to the emperor than we are in the south, but the emperor derives no benefits from our loyalty. For the people in the village, Peking itself is much stranger than living in the next world. We believe that Peking and its emperor are one, something like a cloud peacefully moving under the sun as the ages pass. Now the consequence of such opinions is a life which is to some extent free and uncontrolled. Not in any way immoral. Purity of morals like those in my homeland I have hardly ever come across in my travels, but nonetheless a way of life that stands under no present law and only pays attention to the wisdom and advice which reaches across to us from ancient times. So traditions and those kinds of norms and standards trump any imperial law that comes around. It's as though the emperor is just this handy legend that gets passed on. At the local level, it's totally irrelevant to day-to-day action. What's important is knowing your neighbor. And it's not that they're unloyal or immoral, it just doesn't matter. Number 11, he lists the reasons for this. He says, quote, "It's true that in the main things, the blame rests with the government, which has neglected to cultivate the institution of empire sufficiently clearly so that it is immediately and ceaselessly effective right up to the most remote frontiers of the empire." And that's just, colonization 101. If you want to create an empire, you have to make sure that every single subject, no matter how far away they are, understands the nature and meaning of the power that you exert. But the narrator continues, "On the other hand, however, there is in this also a weakness in the people's power of imagining or believing, which has not succeeded in pulling the empire out of its deep contemplative state in Peking and making it something fully vital and present in the hearts of subjects, who nonetheless want nothing better than to feel its touch once and then die from the experience." So, although there's a failure on the part of government, there's also a failure in the imagination or the belief in the people and in the need or the nature of the nation state or the empire, whatever you want to call it. And what these people want, according to the narrator, is to be touched once by the sublime and awesome power of governmental power, to be indicated and isolated and individuated once, and then die from the shock of it. But they don't. There's a failure, there's a fracture in that ability to believe, and that's also what weakens the power of the nation state. So in conclusion, it's all the more striking that this very weakness appears to be one of the most important ways of unifying our people. And again, this is the narrator. Indeed, if one may go so far as to use the expression, it is the very ground itself on which we live. To provide a detailed account of why we have a flaw here would amount not just to rattling our consciences, but what is much more serious, to making our legs tremble. So here Kafka gets really close to the point that he wants to make. The point that this weakness is something we don't want to explore, because doing so would undermine this kind of weird, delicate balance between having power and not having power, or a relationship with governmental power that keeps us somewhat protected from its ability to absolutely control us. There's nothing scarier than a government that has absolute control over its citizens. It's terrifying. We need that weakness, and to investigate or explore what that weakness is or how it works or to try to undo it would be horrifying. And so Kafka stops there. So overall in this story, Kafka sketches out the limitations of power, which ultimately becomes a failure of the imagination. From a distance, one can participate in a social world that one recognizes simultaneously being irrelevant to daily existence. So now we'll turn to In the Penal Colony, the second story for today. This story focuses on 4 individuals who are outliers in a world of power and order. The condemned man is the target of justice, but the force of law disempowers him. He has lost the right to autonomy. The soldier must follow the commands of the officer. He's simultaneously empowered and disempowered. He has power over the condemned man, but the power isn't his to own. He lacks authority over his own power. His power is only relative to the one who's the target. The power relations, therefore, deny him the right of refusal. The officer would seem to have the most power, but he himself always also submits to his basic principle, which is, quote, "Guilt is always beyond a doubt." So because of that, he divests himself of authority to be able to go against that basic principle and assumes anybody who is accused is always guilty. The guilt is beyond a doubt. The traveler, the 4th character, would also seem to be outside the flow of power, but his very presence as a witness alters the proceedings and changes the direction of the story itself. His judgment casts the justness of the apparatus in the story into question. So I'm going to start with the kind of turning point in the story. It's where, I'll just read it, quote, "The traveler went over to the officer and said, 'You don't yet know what I'll do. Yes, I'll tell the commandant my opinion of the procedure, not in a meeting, but in private.'" And the context is the officer's wanting the traveler to say, this way of doing justice, this apparatus being written on the body, this punishment system is great. You need to keep it. And the traveler's saying, "No, I'm not going to do that. And not only will I not do that, I'm not going to stick around to be a supporter." He says, quote, "In addition, I won't stay here long enough to be able to get called into some meeting or other. Early tomorrow morning I leave, or at least I go on board ship." It did not look as if the officer had been listening. "So the process has not convinced you," he said to himself, and smiled the way an old man smiles over the silliness of a child, concealing his true thoughts behind that smile. "Well then, it's time," he said finally, and suddenly looked at the traveler with bright eyes which contained some sort of demand, some appeal for participation. "Time for what?" asked the traveler uneasily, but there was no answer. So it's the scene, it's the time when the officer realizes that his world, his view of the world, his way of just doing justice or enacting justice isn't going to last, and he has to give it up. And why the traveler's verdict makes a difference and nobody else's on the island is, Kafka doesn't go into that. But for whatever reason, he's compelled. So the officer submits to the punishment, which again, the apparatus is a machine that writes the punishment or writes the verdict of what the guilt is on the body in a 12-hour series of tattoos that are cut into the flesh until the one condemned realizes what they've done. The one inscribed on the officer is "Be just." And so that's the question that lingers, is whether or not the officer is just. Does the officer realize that what has been done to others was unjust, or is he unconvinced by that yet? Kafka doesn't answer those questions. But as they're putting the officer, who's about to kill the condemned man, into the machine, the condemned man misunderstands it. Kafka says, quote, "The condemned man especially seemed to be struck by a premonition of some sort of significant transformation. What had happened to him was now taking place with the officer. Perhaps this time the procedure would play itself out to its conclusion. The foreign traveler had probably given the order for it, so that was revenge. Without having suffered all the way to the end himself, nonetheless he would now be completely avenged. A wide, silent laugh now appeared in his face and never went away." And it's great because the condemned man has absolutely no idea of what's going on. And even though he understands it as personally directed toward him and is pleased by that fact, the reader's aware that it's a complete misunderstanding and it has absolutely nothing to do with him at all. The fact that he is or isn't dying is totally irrelevant to the story. It just happens to be that way. But from his perspective, the condemned man is overjoyed at getting revenge, even though it's not revenge that's going on. And that's one of the ways that Kafka helps readers understand the limitations of their own awareness of any given situation. What you perceive as being true is probably wrong. It's probably a misunderstanding. The next chunk I'm going to read is the destruction of the machine. So here it goes, quote, "The traveler, by contrast, was very upset. Obviously, the machine was breaking up. Its quiet operation had been an illusion. He felt as if he had to look after the officer now that the latter could no longer look after himself. The harrow was not riding, but only stabbing, and the bed was not rolling the body, but lifting it, quivering up into the needles. The traveler wanted to reach in to stop the whole thing if possible. This was not the torture the officer wished to attain. It was murder, pure and simple. He stretched out his hands. But at that point, the harrow was already moving upwards into the side of the skewered body, just as it did in other cases, but only in the 12th hour. This is another great Kafka moment. Somebody wants to help, and it's already too late. It's always already too late when you decide that you need to help. It can't be done. There's nothing to be done but witness death and torture. Kafka's pretty cherry sometimes. The harrow wanted to move back to its original position, but as if realizing that it could not free itself of its load, it remained over the hole. "Help!" the traveler called out to the soldier and the condemned man, and he himself grabbed the officer's feet. At this point, almost against his will, the traveler looked at the face of the corpse, and from the officer's perspective, the glory of the apparatus was having the guilty person really realize, just visually be transformed with the revelation of why they are guilty and what they've done wrong. And so the traveler's looking for that awareness on the officer. It was as if it had been on life. He could discover no sign of the promised transformation or promised transfiguration. What all the others had found in the machine, the officer had not. His lips were pressed firmly together. His eyes were open, and they looked as if they had when he was alive. His gaze was calm and convinced. The tip of a large iron needle had gone through his forehead. Nothing changes for the officer. And again, Kafka doesn't tell the reader why. It's left as a mystery. We don't know if it's because he wasn't guilty. We don't know if it's because in understanding his guilt, he was satisfied. Totally open questions. Not enough information to be able to make a determination about it. We're left in the dark. We can get close to the truth in the neighborhood. We can't know the truth about the situation with any certainty at all. The story ends when the traveler decides to go visit the tea house where the former commandant, who had engineered the apparatus that the officer was promoting and continuing on, was buried. And so the traveler is looking at what's going on, wants to see the grave of the old commandant who had so inspired the officer, and here's what he finds. Quote, on the ground floor of the house was a deep, low room, like a cave, with smoke-covered walls and ceiling. Although there was little difference between the tea house and the rest of the houses in the colony, which were all very dilapidated except for the commandant's palatial structure, the traveler was nonetheless struck by the impression of historical memory, and he felt the power of earlier times. The old man is buried here, said the soldier. A place in the cemetery was denied him by the chaplain. For a while the people were undecided where they should bury him. Finally they buried him here. Of course, the officer explained none of that to you, for naturally he was the one most ashamed of it. A few times he even tried to dig the old man up at night, but he was always chased off. So, until this point in the story, the only information we've had about the old commandant came from the officer who revered him. And so for the first time, the traveler and the reader through the traveler understand that this was a really marginal sect that was not promoted or welcomed by anybody in the society. And it's to the extent that they wouldn't even bury him in the grave. So it gives you a totally different perspective and point of view on what power was like on the island than one had gotten earlier. And it's a transformative revelation in the text, not necessarily expected, but given at the point of death. Whereas the grave asked the traveler, who could not believe the soldier, and again, he can't believe him because the officer is so compelling in terms of what justice looks like in this world. At once both men, the soldier and the condemned man, ran in front of him, and with hands outstretched pointed to the place where the grave was located. They led the traveler to the back wall, where the guests were sitting at a few tables. They were presumably dock workers, strong men with short, shiny black beards. None of them wore coats, and their shirts were torn. A whisper went up around the traveler. It's a foreigner. He wants to look at the grave. They pushed one of the tables aside, under which there was a real gravestone. It was a simple stone, low enough to remain hidden under a table. It bore an inscription in very small letters, which the traveler had to kneel down in order to read. It read, "Here lies the old commandant. His followers, who are now not permitted to have a name, buried him in this grave and erected this stone. There exists a prophecy that the commandant will arise again after a certain number of years, and from this house will lead his followers to reconquer the colony. Have faith and wait." So it's this messianic cult that's inspired by this figure of justice, and it's a justice at odds with the justice of the world. It's kind of how religions work. When the traveler had read it and got up, he saw the men standing around him and smiling as if they had read the inscription with him, found it ridiculous, and were asking him to share their opinion. The traveler acted as if he had not noticed, distributed some coins among them, waited until the table was pushed back over the grave, left the tea house, and went to the harbor. And that's it. Then he takes off. Nobody knows what his opinion is. He just leaves. So what I'd like to do to conclude the conversation about this story is just to go through the characters one by one and see kind of what they represent in terms of power. What holds the characters together is a relationship to an overarching power structure which each participates in but none control. So when you look at the old commandant, here's what the officer says about him. Quote, or after hearing the officer's explanation, this is the traveler's statement. Then he was in his own person a combination of everything. Was he soldier, judge, engineer, chemist, and draftsman? And he was all those things. And if you go back, if you look back at what we discussed from Heidegger, that kind of combination of knowledge is what represents the founding of a world. In this case, the penal colony's world. He's a founder of it, the way that Franklin, in that similar kind of hodgepodge of all sorts of things, was able to help found America in a certain kind of way. Apparatus. This is the hinge of the island, or the colony, an object that knits together the truth of the old commandant and stretches that truth into a world beyond his life. It can only function as long as it has believers willing to submit to it. So it's an object that keeps that world held together. It keeps that world in place, but it requires people like the officer to participate in its truth and to perpetuate its truth among others. As soon as the officer loses his faith, the machine is destroyed, that way of justice is gone. The officer participates in the truth revealed by the old commandant. The preserver of it, he is also subjected to it and is willing to die for it. This is why he treats the papers of the old commandant like sacred relics, like scripture. It is holy. Nonetheless, at no point does the officer claim ownership over the system of power. He finds himself merely a conduit of it and resigns himself to the loss of that world. The condemned man has, quote, an expression of dog-like resignation. His fortunes are not his own. Kafka, and we'll be reading this throughout the next few weeks, often looks at dogs as having a kind of resignation to power systems that's odd. So as we keep reading throughout the rest of this class, keep an eye out for things that are dog-like, and think back to why that affects the condemned man and how understanding the condemned man helps you understand future characters. The soldier is like the condemned man who doesn't understand the language that the traveler and the officer speak or what's occurring. He subjects others to the law and is himself subjected to it. He's basically indistinguishable from the condemned man, as all are. All pretty much could be the condemned man at any one point, which is, I think, part of the point that Kafka is trying to make. The traveler doubts his influence. The narrator says basically he was honest and unafraid. Nonetheless, even though he felt himself outside of the world of the penal colony, his views on justice were the deciding force. And part of Kafka's point here seems to be that there's no outside of a power system. That which observes any part of the system becomes a part of it. You can't remain outside of a system of power. You're going to have a relationship to it, and once you have a relationship to it, you're going to be within its purview. There's no escape. The new commandant has a different understanding of justice, but it's a view of justice that lacks the forcefulness of the old commandant's vision. It's more popular, it's more bureaucratic, and that's why the new commandant merely wants to weaken the old world by starving it through a lack of funding, and that's what the officer complains about. There's no more funding for the machine or the apparatus. It's that way of going through the world is dying, and is dying a slow bureaucratic death. If you want to change the world, you starve it for money. You make it less of a priority, and that's how you change the world to become far more mediocre. Maybe more just, maybe not, but that's not the commandant's interest. He just wants it to be more regulated in a certain kind of way. So in conclusion, 2 last points. The Great Wall discusses the nature of power is based in narratives and imagination that come to prominence during formal and social education. The incomplete nature of these stories allows for an importantly incomplete participation in this power framework. What's interesting is Kafka's choice to set the story during an ancient time, long before our age of digital communication and digital surveillance. There were still faster ways for stories to allow power structures to gain a more intimate space in individual lives. This was clearly apparent during Kafka's life in Germany. The communication was far faster in Germany, in early 20th century Germany, than it was during the Great Wall time. And so it's interesting that he sets it that far back and still is allowing readers in the present to understand the nature of the distance and power as being inversely related. 2. In the penal colony, it looks at the influence of power over our lives, including the power that we invest in seemingly neutral objects. The world has become a penal colony, where power stretches to touch everyone. There's no neutral perspective or position in places organized relative to power systems. Even if one can viscerally understand one's guilt, even if one's sentence becomes inscribed into the flesh until bearing its testimony ends up knitting flesh from life, that kind of understanding ultimately seems a vehicle to allow powers as self-justifications. It's never about your understanding. It's always about what power is allowed to do to you and how you wear power's mark until your death. And that's Kafka. Thank you.